Welcome to What a Word is Worth, a space for creative minds to speak about viable ways to heal the world through writing and other inventive mediums. This is your host, Marianela Medrano. I am the founder of Palabra Training Center, where words are given as medicine. Today, my guest is someone with whom I share the privilege of reclaiming a place in history for our ancestors and for ourselves. The Tainos of the Caribbean and the Khoi and San people have been portrayed in history as extinct. They have been buried under the violence of erasure. This is a part of the collective trauma that unfortunately unites us. So my guest today is Dr. Bernedette Muthien, who is a facilitator, researcher, writer, poet, whose research, publications, facilitation, and programs are designed specifically for unique institutions and contexts, including diversity, transformation, or transforming mainstream. And she has held executive positions in academia, civil society, and the public sector in South Africa and abroad. An accomplished facilitator, researcher, and poet with over 200 publications and conference presentations, some of which have been translated into at least 16 other languages. She was the first Fulbright Amy Bill Fellow at Stamford University and holds postgraduate degrees in political science. She serves on various international advisory boards, including the journals Human Society Security Studies and Journal of Human Security, as well as the International Institute on Peace and Education. Welcome, Bernadette.
Thank you for having me.
It is such a pleasure. I'll say more about, I basically was chasing you since the moment I read your work, and I am so glad you responded. Tell us about, just to start our conversation, tell us about your encounter with poetry. And when did you realize poetry was seated in you? Do you subscribe to the idea that poetry is healing? And did the brutality of apartheid had anything to do with you choosing poetry as one of your voices? I mean, it just ended in 1990, so you were caught in the fire, right? So there are many questions here. You choose whatever you want to tackle from there.
Let's do it Indigenous style and see where it goes.
Yeah.
So to start with, I come from a large working class activist family. We were impoverished, and I don't exaggerate the impoverishment. And my generation of children in the 1980s were extremely radical. We were radicalized by the ones who came before us, but we were radical in our own rights. And especially here in the Western Cape Town, the streets were on fire. And that was my generation. We literally put our bodies on the line in ways that built on the struggles of all the people that came in the decades before. And so in that era, the anti-apartheid struggle had a deep rootedness in what we call arts and culture broadly. And so at every mass meeting, there would be poetry and music. There is a family friend who is now deceased, She used to have a guitar. She became a deputy minister after apartheid, but there she was a PhD in psychology. There she's standing, singing song in patois or colloquial language about, the struggles for women against gender violence, whatever, and so on. And I, from a very young age, I think from age 13 or something, they just hold you up like this and stuck you on a makeshift wooden platform and gave you sheafs of what was roneoed at the time. We did photocopiers there, no fax machines, it was roneo. So sheafs of like other people's poetry, radical poetry from around the world, and made me read it because they knew how I had been a poet. I was already a child poet. So I cut my teeth in the struggle as a little kiddie, being hauled up onto the wooden makeshift platform. But I must confess that I had come from quite a creative family. And it was because of poverty that we weren't able to express our full potentials. For example, when I was perhaps preschool or in early elementary school, there was an auntie in the community who was giving piano lessons. She really, really, really loved me. And she whacked me on my poor little baby fingers too, a lot. But she thought I was very gifted as a pianist. And so she came and begged my parents to pay for even a discounted rate. She obviously said she couldn't do it completely free of charge. She also had to earn a living. And my parents were so impoverished that they could not. I mean, between bread and piano lessons. So it's a choice. And to this day, I am, sometimes I'm dreaming and I come to and I have the most extraordinary music as if angels are singing in my ears. And so these gifts we all have variously, and no poverty can take it away from us. So the music I still carry within my very, cells. And the easiest thing and the cheapest thing was a pencil and paper, and hence the poetry. When I was 17, I was imprisoned. I was a student leader and a feisty young girl. And I was imprisoned variously, epically over some long period of time, months, in different places. And in the apartheid era, they would give you a Bible. That's it. That's your only book. And the Bible had covers of Cape Town scenery, and we have oceans, mountain, all very gorgeous. I like the Caribbean. And so I would remove the covers and wrote, somebody threw a pen over the wall for me and I got it in the yard. And so I was writing poetry even in the covers of these Bibles in the middle of, epic detentions in deserts and other interesting encounters. So the creativity is a part of me, whether I like it or not. Sometimes I have like intelligence, sometimes you curse yourself and like, can I not be so, but it's both an intrinsic part of me, like my fingers, my limbs, and it's also a vehicle and expression. And you're quite right that it has a potential to heal the self and the potential to heal others. It is an opportunity to connect with people in a deeper way, both intellectual, but also much more so heart-centered and cellular, if you know what I mean.
Yes, exactly. Is this idea that actually poetry emanates from the cells, from the body, and from the body of Earth. It's what we know, actually, those of us who commute with poetry. This is so beautiful, your answer, and also this, what I'm getting is that what led you to poetry was curiosity, was a need to respond, and there were also music there, which is also another embodied manifestation of creativity. So that explains why your poetry is so rich and so moving and so fluid. So what I'm thinking is, let's move now from one of the thing that most that caught my attention the most about you and your work was the idea of repatriation. And when I read about it, I just something happened to me, to my body, and I said, I have to find this person. I need to continue this conversation. I want to know more. There is such a, what I call in embodied writing, sympathetic resonance in our work, that I will say, without knowing each other or reading each other, actually, we have been in conversation for a long time.
Indeed.
Maybe pre-birth, right? So tell our audience about this concept of rematriation and how it has inserted the scholarship of women's studies. Tell us more about it, this idea of seeding, going back to the seed, to the origin, to the Great Mother.
Thank you, Marianela. Rematriation, if you take rematriation in this hand and you take the usual word that people use, which is repatriation, which is bringing back the dead bodies from Vietnam, Kuwait, Iraq. Yeah. And rematriation is a concept that is more life-oriented. For example, insemination versus germination, a plant is coming to life. We are seeding life, and in our wombs and in our bodies, we have the potential to create and host life. So rematriation I first learned of, and I must always give acknowledgement to where things come from, if there is. Otherwise, it's just an infinity of knowledges which we tap into. And I find it most peculiar how people will stake a claim to something like, I invented the word. Now I could write a book and say, I invented the word rematriation, which is complete and utter nonsense. But the Iroquois scholar based at Toledo University in Ohio, Barbara Alice Mann, a brilliant woman, I call her my auntie friend. She first introduced, she just kidnapped me in 2005 when we met in person. And
you're very kidnappable.
I shouldn't use those languages. She just adopted me and I became one of her little siblings or, children. And so she had learned a great deal with her, and we've wrestled a great deal together with issues pertaining to Indigenous feminisms. And she said to me, there is this word called rematriation, and it's her poet friend, Susan Deercloud, who first was grappling with it. And so I took what they were doing and I brought it home here in the southernmost tip of Africa. And I began to knead it like a lovely sourdough bread or something. And for me, it's literally a different way to repatriation, bringing home dead bodies. And rematriation is bringing home into the self, into the family, into the home, into the community, all that may have been cleaved off from us. And a lot of our woman-centeredness, that's been cleaved from us. Growing up, the father used to come home and give the entire week's wage packet to the mother. That's how the matriarchy or matricentricity existed. And we have lost touch with all of that. And we have, after apartheid, especially a continuation of violence in the form of gender-based violence, etc. And so rematriation is to say, people, those who are not in touch, wake up. This is not who we are. These violent, people, these unconscious people, this is not us. We are mindful people. We are compassionate people. We are just people. We're people with integrity. And to remind us of our Indigenous values. And for me, really, that is the strength of anything. Like most of Latin America, we grew up Marxist and me Catholic, but so there's a lot of, left thinking in where we come from. It's our roots as well as anti-apartheid activists and children in my generation. But for me, far long before Karl Marx was born, bless him or not, depending on your inclination regarding him, So there is indigenous knowledge. It preceded all of it. You know, astronomy, the origins of mathematics, arguably founded in Africa and the Middle East before the Europeans went and plagiarized it, etc. So for me, it's very deep, what some people call deep history, but it's also deep in terms of intuition, in terms of knowing it within myself. And when I feel it, I speak it, I write it, it feels to me as if it's truth, as opposed to the violence of lies that we grow up under occupation.
Yeah, there is so much to pull from what you're saying. Let's go to this idea of, perspective is everything, right? And perspective in writing specifically is so crucial because it touches on, or it determines the emotional reaction of the reader, or what is called in embodied writing sympathetic resonance. Again, I mentioned it before. So you and your colleagues write about feminist psi and epistema or the erasure of multi-generational knowledge. And I think that's at the heart, right, of rematriation. When you think about the work that you have done, you, Barbara, and others, I'm thinking about your beautiful Rethinking Africa, which is such a gem. Yay! It's like a Bible for me. What are you discovering as you disseminate this work? What is the response, the reactions? For instance, you were telling me you went to a school to talk about apartheid to students. What is the response when you bring out these concepts and these different perspectives? What are you finding today?
It's the most interesting thing. In about 2005, when I met Barbara Ellis-Mann, and then we journeyed together variously with others, Indigenous and non-Indigenous women, I was very struck by how nobody knew the notion of rematriation. So that when I conceptualized even a roundtable at an International Women's World Conference, for example, that it would be exciting and people would come. So there was definite need, a definite thirst for knowledge and reclamation or rematriation. And so in writing this book, ironically now, remember that I'd heard of rematriation, forgive me, I have allergies. I've heard of rematriation since 2005 and have been actively using it. It's a bit like intersectionality.
Yeah.
Decades ago, nobody was talking about it. So all of a sudden, with the production of this book, and just before this book, I wrote a small piece in a progressive publication. And suddenly rematriation is like on everybody's lips. It's the most exciting thing. A colleague friend produced a piece of clay sculpture thingamajiggy of pot sort of thing. It's the most extraordinary thing. And she called this rematriation, having read the book, smitten with the concept. And so it's just on its own steam, it's just rolling on its own. At the apartheid lecture to the students at a local college, they were mesmerized by the idea of rematriation and they loved it. And as they was, the professor was scrolling through my book, said, "Ooh, the whole book is full of rematriation." I said, "Indeed, it is." So I was so thrilled.
Yeah, but Bernadette, I think what happens is that, and the whole concept alludes to it, that we know this. This is the knowledge that was taken away, that was buried, right? So when we encounter, it's like, of course, Of course, I know this, right?
That's exactly.
And this is, what I find is so important is for women specifically to come together, and that's why I'm so taken by your book, because it's this communal effort, right, of scholars who are coming together. And again, going back to perspectives, it's like not everyone is saying the same thing, even though everyone is dancing around the same concept. But there are multiple perspectives here as to how we are going to reclaim our place in history. So I'm so glad that I'm not surprised, and yet I am so glad that the students, the reception is such that there is openness. Because I'm thinking in the Caribbean, my experiences is not that easy for us to go counter to the status quo. There is a lot of resistance. There is a lot of ignoring or diminishing or ridiculing our work, calling us locas or whatever, when we try to say this. So I'm glad. So going back to, the idea of rematriation and the idea of reclamation, and also the idea of interdependence and the idea of every knowledge existing in relationship to others. So let's go back to Karl Marx and your relationship to his legacy in terms of the work that you have done. And I'm saying, I'm posing this question from the idea that nothing is lost, right? Or that everything is interrelated and everything is cross-pollinating, the good, the bad, the in-between, right?
Marx is an interesting character as a human being. Some people suggest he's a misogynist, the way his poor, long-suffering wife and the children were just dying, one after the other. It's like horrific conditions. Did he care or not, whatever,
Right.
and, to what extent. And he could even be, transposed into 2022 with the sort of mythos around the male academic, the super philosopher, the god-like creature. And the essence of indigeneity and matricentric, as in center of women and other people, usually derided people, is that there is no God. For example, the Quakers have this notion that there is God in each one of us. God is in the self. So there is no external, at least for patriarchal God. Right. Exactly. So the deification of whether it be Karl Marx, Mahatma Gandhi, Gandhiji, our very own Nelson Mandela Madiba, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, all of these deifications is flawed because they are human and were human and are human. So in indigenous societies, and the ones I'm speaking of, there are two parts to it, and the peace studies people do a lot of research into socially egalitarian societies, and they look, for example, to Scandinavia in particular. The more socially egalitarian the societies, the less violence there is. And I would add, less gender violence too. And then what is the significance? It's not just socially egalitarian, because when you do that as gender blindness, we must also insert the gender egalitarianism, because even in Scandinavian countries to this very minute, they will say that men still do only a fraction of the domestic work and childcare that the women do in Sweden and other countries to this day. And now juxtapose this experience with indigenous societies where people are socially egalitarian and gender egalitarian. There are roles for male persons to nurture people who identify as boy children. Note how free I am with gender, because genders in essence can be freeing if you wish. And as long as it's a choice and not imposed upon a person. And so, and And so in these societies, whether it be Burkina Faso, whether it be Barbara Ellis-Mann's Haudenosaunee, or indeed the San in the Kalahari, men and women nurture. And another auntie friend of mine, Genevieve Vaughan, who has worked a lot on the so-called feminist gift economy, maternal gift economy. And she has coined many years ago another word, which I so love. It's mother with an ER at the end of it. And it denotes that, so it removes the biological essentialism without, being, how to put it, without committing murder of the feminine or the woman or the mother, but just to illustrate that the nurturance that is needed in society, by its very nature, we need nurturance, whether it's from birth to injury to elderhood. We need nurturance, and the nurturance is not gender specific. Everybody is a motherer in Indigenous societies. Everybody should be motherers. And when we begin to embody this nurturance that is mutual and unconditional, then our broken societies will be better and less violent. And therein lies the rub around the nurturance and because masculinity is constructed so as to destroy the vulnerability in young boys. Emasculation, the way it's done, don't be a sissy, whatever. And women too are taught to fear one another, be jealous of one another, hate one another. You can't imagine, especially older women. It's an epic struggle continuously. Millennials don't know how lucky they really are for all the struggles that have gone before. And so to re-heal that and to say, we are here all together, big sisters, little sisters, everybody's sisters. We are all sisters. We are all supposed to be together like a functional rather than a dysfunctional family, like a community.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you're pointing this thing that there is toxic masculinity and there is also toxicity in the feminine, right?
Indeed.
So the work of an egalitarian society is looking at staying in the middle, right? And not going to the extreme. So I'm glad that you're making that distinction. And you have written on the importance of remembering the cost of gender discrimination and gender violence to society, and how violence it is, that discrimination in society, and you're just pointing that out. Now, you wrote specifically, you said that how we all suffer from patriarchy and from gender discrimination and the violence, because it is violence, and you propose gender egalitarianism as the solution. So I'm glad that you're also seeing, as you continue to disseminate these, that you're seeing, oh my God, the new people, they are collecting the benefits of the work that has been done for them, and you're seeing a different way of being, right? So can you say more about what you're seeing in South Africa today in terms of, the young people absorbing the work, metabolizing the work that the, I want to say the elders, right, have done for them?
It's a complicated matter. Born frees is what we call the people born after 1994, which is when our democracy began. So born frees are fascinating. There are some have, more privileged born frees, and it's always wonderful to watch people. It's like I'm studying anthropology. I just stare at them the whole time, and the way they raise their children in very interesting ways. My nephew, for example, he just grabs the kid like this, and, you know, whereas we were like, ooh, and they just hands-on and like running around, changing diapers, feeding. And so there's no like shame about, you know, masculine roles, feminine roles at all. It's just a complete, you know, you do what needs to be done. All of the boys are doing that, and supporting the women. So that's the one good part of it. The other part of it is the legacies of brutality. And remember, apartheid was only some 50 years long. And before apartheid, we had brutal colonialism, enslavement, genocide, and genocide of the indigenous peoples. And so all of those 300, several hundred years of trauma resonates and resides still in the population, and in particular in men across the board, but our own, may I say, Black men in the British sense of Black, as in not white men, but men in general too, across classes, across ages. And this then personifies, you know, manifests itself in extreme gender-based violence that persists to this very day. It's almost as if the 1970s feminists, my aunties, did not exist, as if my lifetime struggle, you know, did not exist. And so what we're having now is like epic violences in universities, where men are threatened by the ascendancy of young Black women and coming into their full fruition of full power with scholarships and other empowerment programs, etc. But is, you know, entrenched in the institutions, because we do need to nurture, like in the Caribbean, you have a whole generation began some decades ago to get all the women to have doctorates. Wherever I go to an international meeting, there's a Caribbean woman, she's gorgeous and she has a doctorate. It's the most wonderful thing. So we've been trying to do that for the last 20 years here now, and the backlash has been very severe. So we have horrific crimes against women, and young women in particular, young Black women in particular, across the country. And there's a deep sense of, you know, what are we missing here, and where have we, you know, not failed necessarily, because you can't call people's entire lives failures, but how can we be smarter in our interventions and working with young people in general, so that you know, the femicide, a woman is murdered every 4 or so hours in South Africa by a man, and usually a male partner. And so how can we more effectively make that intervention that is clearly not adequate, all these decades of struggle by different feminists?
Yeah, and
we have,
you know,
pleasure and we have pain.
right, exactly. And our histories are so alike in that sense. I mean, the feminicides in the Dominican Republic are just, you know, it's something like, where do we begin? I mean, we know that we must begin by expressing, by putting it out there, by using all the resources we have. In our case, we use scholarship and poetry, right, as a way to, I mean, we're basically talking about collective trauma that it's still, you know, it's a reality that needs attention, and it needs attention now, because otherwise it's just our generations, that the generations to come are going to continue carrying it forth. So the work is to give voice to the pain. Not just, I mean, we have to celebrate the accomplishments, and yes, we do have to say this is what is happening now, that is our strength, but we also have to speak about the ouch, what is still, you know, in need. And one of the issues, you know, I think it's not only in the Dominican Republic, but in the Caribbean, that there is the tendency of wanting to keep things hush hush. If you write something that depicts, let's say, you know, right now in the Dominican Republic, we have this horrendous relationship with Haiti, our, you know, brothers and sisters of Haiti. that in my view is basically based on skin pigmentation, right? Because we want to think that we are white. We don't want to own, who we truly are. So it is important that these things are said. And what I was saying is that for us, it's not easy, because when you speak up, then you are, you're easily put down, or you are accused of not loving your country, not being pro Dominican Republic in my case. So it is important. And in your introduction, I want to bring this to what you said in the introduction to the international webinar on nonviolence in practice. You cited crucial elements for collective healing, which is at the heart of this podcast. And you talk about compassion, the commitment to doing no harm, and the notion of Ubuntu. I am because you are. Tell us more about how you are weaving, and you and perhaps your colleagues are weaving all these elements, and how they are impacting both the work that you do and how the work is received.
So to start with, the 60s feminists came up with the personal is political, in particular to deal with domestic violence.
Right.
But indigenous feminism would imply, and decolonizing feminism would imply that everything is political, the spiritual, and that it's not one, or it's not a linear thing, but it's an intersectional thing, and or multiple shapes. Yeah. So all of it is interconnected, and the African concept of Ubuntu, which is more than just a philosophy, but an actual way of life, some Ubuntu scholars would assert. And it speaks to this, which is resonant in almost all indigenous societies, especially those that are still matricentric, whether it be Barbara Ellis Mann's Haudenosaunee, or my Indian colleagues in Northeast India, or even in Kerala, which are all matricentric societies. Burkina Faso, you name it, a veritable Angola to Zimbabwe of matricentricity in Africa. So the Ubuntu in essence just mean that I am because I care. I am because I belong. I'm a member of. And even if you take the word Khoi and San, each means human. So when people are saying I'm Khoi San, they say I'm human. I'm a human belonging to other human beings, I'm a human belonging to society. So it's very, very different to Thomas Hobbes's 17th century notion of life in a state of nature, solitary, nasty, brutish, poor, and short, for example, to try to show the connectedness between us, the circularity, the interdependence, and how the World Bank will say, oh, people are very poor, they live on $1 a day. People don't live on $1 a day. They live on solidarity. They live on the gift paradigm, indigenous compassion. You need to go to the hospital, here's my 1 cent, your cent there, and there's the bus fare to take the person to hospital, etc. It is that solidarity, community, the compassion. So therein lies the rub for us. We've been also brutalized as colonized peoples, whether you are white or not you personally, Marianella, but people of European descent are too colonized. Their consciousness are colonized. Think of a preppy Ivy League white privileged able-bodied hetero boy, for example. He's been bashed into a mold, to be a little soldier for that particular ideology, and so on. So everybody is brutalized by this oppressive system and colonized by it, and demanding of us to continue to replicate it and its ideology and violences. But we have to, this is the importance of rematriation for me, is we have to look inside ourselves and in our own wisdoms. I don't mind old Karl Marx or pretty much anyone else for that matter. But for me, when I traversed the whole of the Kalahari over several years and the country and spoke to elder women in Southern Africa alone, let alone elder women like Barbara Ellis-Mann and Patricia Mukim in Northeast India and so on, and the wisdoms that reside in them, the most profound wisdoms on how to govern a society, and they have been governing their societies, the Mosul in China, they have been living like that forever, and they still live in the midst of patriarchy and capitalism, even Chinese state capitalism, whatever it's called, in the midst of all those depredations and the attacks and onslaughts upon Christianity, for example, the Christianization of some of these societies, and so on. In the midst of such patriarchal onslaught, they still exist today, and they show us the models, how inheritance will work. The youngest daughter should inherit. Why? Because she's young, she can look after the old people, and so on, and so it carries on. So there's a particular logic to the ways in which the society is run, and I think if we want to really, really learn models of alternatives to the kind of capitalist patriarchy we used to, it's an indigenous knowledge wherein we will find the wisdom. And I truly would like, human beings to go back and find old people and speak to them. And the pain will be there because they've suffered greatly, but the knowledge is there, and there it is, I'm just a vessel for other people's wisdoms and to try to transmit that. I don't know how to put that anymore.
Yeah, and what I'm thinking is in the Dominican Republic, I had written and spoken, I have a TED talk where I talk about the concept of juntas. And juntas are these gatherings of the campesinos where everyone's work was done without the exchange of money. People will gather, go work in someone parcela's farm, and then everyone came, all the work was done, then people will exchange the goods, and everyone will go home with something to eat, and then the next day they will go and do the same thing for other people. So that's an indigenous practice. And
that
what
collectivism,
the collectivism, exactly. Like that's the future. That was the past, and this is the future. Is the collectivism, is the coming together, right? So it is so important what you're saying, that if we look back, we're gonna find the answers. That, in my trainings, I said, let's look back in order to go forward. Because if we don't take that retrospective look to see where we are standing, we're not gonna know where we, how we are going to proceed. And if we want to do away with colonization, we're gonna have to go and find the foundations, and the foundations are collective, the collective thinking. I think that the reason, I sustain that the Tainos are not extinct, because if you think about, what happened was the Tainos were there, the colonizers came, then they brought our brothers and sisters from Africa, and the Tainos and the Africans got together. These were two humongous forces. Are you telling me that these people were so powerful that they exterminated these collective? I don't think so. What happens was that, there were mergings, yes, of things, but in my thesis, what I was trying to do was say to people, we're here. Stop, looking to Europe to find, our essence. we're
That's
here.
what I did 20 years ago in the academy and elsewhere. I kept saying,
Yeah.
we're here, we're here. I had to go to the Kalahari to say, you know, it's not a myth. People are not extinct. It's the most absurd thing. Here's the grandmothers. I have beautiful photographs. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, how could you? Like, say people are extinct, languages are extinct. They're not.
Yeah.
People are still speaking the same interesting.
Right.
Yeah. And I would like to do this journey with you if you want me to come with you. I love, you know, the repatriation, going to find the old people and old women in particular with all the healing, you know, the plants, the knowledge, medicine, and pharmaceuticals are just, you know, extracting all of that knowledge for their own gain. But you know, it's how we keep our COVID. Many people have been taking indigenous herbs, strong to boost immunity and so on, and to for antiviral purposes. So I think we have a lot in common, you and I.
Right. So we must continue, you know, these conversations, whatever. I mean, that's what I do as a therapist, as you know, if I am invited anywhere I go, this is the conversation because it is urgent. If we don't have it, we are heading to very dangerous, you know, territory, because this idea of individuality does not work, and it has caused so much harm, as you point out, right? Like these societies that are planted on individualism are doomed to destruction.
That's correct. And for the life of me, when I was learning liberalism at university in the early 1990s at a white liberal university historically, it was this, you know, sort of reification of individualism and individual freedom. But in collectivism, in communities, in indigenous communities, the individual is not completely eliminated or, you know, eroded.
Right.
The individual is part of the collective is part of the individual. It's like a dance together. And I remain as eccentric as I am. Nobody's paddle beating me and making me like straighten my hair or something else. I can remain as unique as I am, but I'm also part of a collective with co-responsibility. They're responsible for me, I'm responsible for them. And so it is. So we're really including in the modern era with technology and social media, etc. You know, with that Instagram, look at me, a kind of narcissism almost. But we really need to strive to move away from that and to see the connections between us. If you were with your transpersonal psychologist, you understand energy.
Yes.
And so we are all connected. Not merely physically or via Zoom, but we are connected energetically with one another. And these are the things that we need to rematriate, reclaim, and make stronger.
And to work with these concepts, right? Like for in some indigenous communities in South and Central America, it's referred to as vincularidad. And then Thich Nhat Hanh call it interbeing, and then other people call it interdependence, right? In the Dominican Republic, the people who were doing the juntas, they were interbeing, right? It's like everything is in constant state of you know, connection, coming together. And that's why I was saying that, you know, yes, there are people whose history or way of telling history have done a lot of damage, but we can't extricate them from the reality. We have to work and of course, be able to diffuse who we are from what they say we were, but they still form part of who we are. Because when someone tries to erase me, that person is having an impact on me. Or what you were saying, like how you began writing poetry, which was very similar to how I began writing it too, was like, there were things happening around me. And the thing, one of the things that the kind of picked my poetic imagination was colorism. Was one of the things that most kind of like stopped me on my tracks. It just didn't make sense. And going back to your experience, actually, let me tie this back. If we go to apartheid, the division of, or the stratification was white, Indigenous, and then wasn't that the order?
No, may I assist? With colonialism, as you know, and they did this in the Caribbean and pretty much everywhere else, even in Rwanda, Hutu and Tutsi, those are constructed identities. There's no ethnic or genetic Hutu and Tutsi, so that they could elevate the one and make it the buffer class.
No, that's what I'm saying, right? So that's
so the buffer classes were created, and so there were different categories of people. There were so many different categories of people, like Cape Malay, Cape Colored. Now remember that the people came from everywhere before colonialism and during colonialism. So there were people from Southern Africa, Mozambique, different shades of people, different kinds of people. There are people who came from Asia, the Dutch colonies, Indonesia, Malaysia, whatnot. People, my father's ancestors came to South Africa from India via Mauritius, my mother being Indigenous. So a whole plethora of diverse people. And in apartheid, with its kind of Victorian sort of Darwinian sort of wanting to box, neatly label, like
that's what I'm saying, right?
Yeah, so they did have a try to create buffer classes with the so-called white people, but even whiteness is a construct, because the biggest fear of a white family was that the black baby would come. And indeed, in some of the families that it happened to. And then they had the Bantu people, and Bantu is just a Nguni word which means person or people. And so they created a whole subhuman race, subhuman group called Bantu, and oppressed these people terribly. And not that it was like any picnic to be mixed race, to be any one of the 16 or whatever other categories, whether Cape Malay, colored Indian, whatever the categories were. You might have gotten 20 Rand per annum more per child at school. We were all in ghettos. There should be no illusion. People think that, colored people, mixed race people like me grew up privileged. We did not. We suffered, we struggled, we starved. And there was solidarity, if you were part of the struggle, which many of us were, between all of us. And we resisted exactly that divide and rule. And when apartheid tried to create colored House of Parliament, Indian House of Parliament, in my generation, the 1980s, we just obliterated all of it. Some of my friends with Molotov cocktails, me, I was a non-violent activist from birth, and I went in solidarity, but yeah, so that's, we resisted that creation of buffer class. And it's one of the biggest divisions in our country that still persists. Even at a flea market, a Zimbabwean trader will like scoff at me, like, as in, you black, what part of that do you mean? In the United States, they don't understand the British concept of black. They look at me and say, I'm not black. There's a Canadian person slightly darker than me. That person is more black than I am. And, I have suffered and been to prison as a child under apartheid. So it's the most interesting thing in relation to the persistent colorism and the assumptions of privilege. But even white people sacrifice greatly. All people sacrifice, men, women, everybody. Queer people sacrifice greatly for liberation. And their names must rise, and they must be known as martyrs and as heroes and sheroes of our struggle.
Yeah.
I don't know whether I answered your question, but I did that.
Yeah,
Indigenous.
I think it's what I was going with that is that when we look at the way that they stratified people, there was this kind of attention to color gradations, is what I'm saying, and that filters, then the consciousness of people, and it impacts then how we treat each other, as you were saying, in the flea market, right? So part of the work of decolonization, decolonizing the self, is being so aware of these things and the mechanisms, and that's what your work actually is helping us do.
Yes.
We are to the end of this, and I am still full of questions, but can you say, just to close, what is the impact of cognitive justice in what we are saying here? If we take, cognitive justice and everything that we have said, especially what we just said about colorism and its impact in how we live our lives and how we intervene.
I think I like your concept of interbeing, and now Marianela will forever be known as the person who introduced me to the notion of interbeing, which I will not integrate.
But remember that we owe to Thich Nhat Hanh.
Yeah. So interbeing, and the idea of interbeing, connection, collectiveness, collectivity, compassion, all of the things that all of this resides, it's the foundation is compassion, and seeing the human in you, and not only a speciesist as in human, but all sentient beings, my environment. I'm looking at my dusty house. My compassion for my dusty house, and so on. So it is, the recognition of the life force within everything, between human beings and all other things in our surroundings. So if you want me to close, I would be delighted to close with one of my old poems called Fragile. Is it from my book? And it's very, very short.
Yes, please.
And I now, for today, dedicate the poem to you, Marianela. It's from a book called Over. It's called Fragile. And on the engender.org.za website, there are different translations of it in German, Italian, and so on. I can't remember the other languages. But so fragile. In your eyes that shift with the anxieties of these times, I see the deepest compassion imaginable. For the perpetrators in all we are, the survivor victims we're forced to be. In your wide open gaze, I see reflected my very own soul. And for your single act of kindness, I offer you my fragile heart.
That's Ubuntu. Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. What a way to close our conversation, which we are kind of, I hope, just closing it for today, but we will continue. I'm kind of seeing us having this conversation in the Caribbean by the Blue Sea. So.
And back here in Cape Town too, by the Blue Sea, 2 seas.
Yes. So thank you so much for joining me today and for really enriching me and the audience with the deepening of these concepts that you have been working for so long. So thank you, and thank you for listening to What a Word is Worth. You can access today's interview at Anchor, YouTube, and other platforms. And if you're interested, hit the subscribe button in your podcast app. And also, if you find the program beneficial, leave us a review. I am with you in love and compassion, always, always.